briefing with support of the Renaissance Foundation and the Center for Reform. Please welcome Deputy Head of Presidential Administration in charge of reforms, Dmytro Shymkiv, who will speak about the progress of reforms and what has been done so far. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It has been a regular system of our meetings on Tuesdays to describe the latest developments and projects. We work in terms of country reforms. In terms of strategic initiatives, you may remember we mentioned the strategy 2020, and based on the comments obtained, we decided to make changes and amendments to certain key success indicators like the inflation rate. We added the energy demand for the economic sector. We added trust of the public in law enforcement agencies. We introduced education quality indicator based on peace standards, and we're in the process of inviting experts to identify welfare indicators. Besides, we made changes to some certain indicators like ease of business environment, percentage of military expenditures to GDP, trust in the judiciary, and the number of Ukrainian movies screened across the country. And I did promise to present the final document this week. Unfortunately, given the lack of resources, we are a bit behind the schedule. And hopefully we'll be able to come up with a welfare indicator quite soon, because at this moment there is no reason to take Gini indicator for that, as Ukraine is hardly Mother First in that term, and it will hardly reflect the real situation in the country. Speaking about operational level, preparations continue to the donor conference on restoration of the country within the scope of the action plan until 2015-2017. We're in the process of making a uniform plan from the suggestions by the ministries. We are also working on coalition agreements, of work groups that have been created involving representatives of the 5 leading partners: Poroshenko's bloc, People's Front, Samopomish, Batkivshina, and Mr. Leshko's party. Consultations are underway, and certain amendments and changes are made to the coalition agreement. This is the document that is also widely regarded by the expert community in terms of possibilities of reconciliation of positions. Last week, Minister of Regional Development Vladimir Groisman and me had the talks regarding
we spoke about reforms in Ukraine, and it's important to mention
цікавий зворотній зв'язок, навколо якого я би хотів зараз зосередитися.
I would like to focus around one document because it's about foreign investors to Ukraine and businessmen in Ukraine. There is a big concern with the situation of pressure on business with the background of statements of politicians and cabinet of ministers, and business speaks about administrative pressure, and in some cases it grows up. And that's a concern. And I can tell you that the number of meetings with foreign enterprise businessmen and ambassadors, there is a comment about pressure on Ukrainian international business in Ukraine, and this is something not to be allowed. I have to analyze the number or situations or categories, cases that began under Yanukovych, and there are a lot of questions to such cases, but they are on active phase, and different institutions continue investigation against those enterprises or against that business. The second category, a new executive branch. They set up create pressure on business, and the number of checks is the same like in during the previous year. That makes that surprises us because we have moratorium for checks, but our check-in bodies they are creative and they find the ways how to set pressure on businessmen. I think that such steps undermine the economy of Ukraine, and it's the second front against our country. This is something not to be allowed, and we speak about this in the administration of the president. This is a priority. We need to clarify everything about illegal pressure on business. In addition to there is the third level or category, a business which gets into troubles when they sign agreements with doubtful partners, and when they build illegal schemes and based on corruption that started during the previous regime, and some foreign investors get into such problems. So to explain to foreign partners about such cases. Again, I would like to mention that bringing foreign investments and improvement of the rating of the country, that is one of the criteria of success, which we discuss in the strategy 2020. That's why we'll pay attention, a lot of attention to that. Now we started to renovate the Council of Ukrainian and foreign investors in Ukraine. We'll look at it. The task is that such a council should turn into a body which allow investors to speak to the administration about the situation in the country and about the government. I can give you lots of examples. When recently the ambassador of a big European country told about our anti-monopoly committee against one international company, which is quite famous, when a suit of anti-monopoly committee cannot be compared with any money, with any sum that which was offered for such a violation by companies. So now there are some other cases when companies speak to us about anti-monopoly committee. That's why tomorrow I will have a meeting with the head of the anti-monopoly committee just to understand the basis of those suits, of those charges. When the average sum of fine from anti-monopoly was 400,000 hryvnia, now it's 50 million. When there is such a big business, such a pressure on Ukraine, on international business, I think they will stop the business in Ukraine. We cannot allow that. That's why state officials who act like during the last ball, and they're trying to create unbelievable pressure on business. We should stop that, and we should come to the point when foreign investors will be interested to invest in Ukraine, even under these conditions. As to e-procurement, that is one of the directions we are developing. We develop a code, write a code. It is we are planning to sign a memorandum, and that code will be given free of charge to state bodies. That will be the support. That's the Transparency International supported the development of such a project, and keep informed. When I speak about state procurements, I should mention quite a strange situation as to Kyiv Council. And they decided to procure a new system of voter for 12.9 million hryvnia, which is much higher than expenditures for one person from the system of Rada for the Parliament of Ukraine. Because personally, in my previous role, I participated, I gave proposals to the Parliament. I consulted the Parliament. I'm surprised, to the Kyiv Council, sorry, I'm surprised that the sum which has it's a tender for one company, all international Ukrainian proposals and the Ukrainian producers who could develop the solution, and somehow Kyiv Council made a decision that to accept one tender, and the sum which is higher than from other proposals. So such a decision of the Kyiv Council makes me worried. Very often we ask about the National Council of Reforms and Executive Committee, and these two groups will be formed after the coalition, after deputies take the oath, and after they form committees and coalition government. Then there will be a decree of the president about the persons who will work in both groups. As to reforms in presidential administration, I would like to give you some numbers because we report on that too. As to reduction of the staff, PA is a leader, and from 579 people, we have 423 now. So we reduce this by 26%. This Secretariat of the Cabinet of Ministers is from 700 to 600 people. So by 66, it's 9%. We also reduced additional bodies by the President of Ukraine and bodies by additional bodies reduced by 10.8%, and central bodies of executive branch by 8.12%. That's the situation until now about the reduction of staff in different bodies of power. As to workflow or e-documents, we stopped suspended the process because the system of e-cooperation, which was built, now it is in off mode because it was supported by the agency Nauki, which is responsible for the function of the system. They will not finance it, that's why they switched it off. And now we discuss with the Cabinet of Ministers how to build an alternative to that e-cooperation, which we initiated a month ago. It was working now, and because of some circumstances, it was switched off, and so these are interesting. Sometimes things that are not good, some are positive. This is what I wanted to share with you. And I would like to say that one of the most important topics will focus our attention this week. It will be the issue of the Council of Ukrainian and International Businessmen and its future, and the president, and how it can work, and how we can hear about problems of investors, and how our state officials can hear, especially under the circumstances which do not support investment climate in Ukraine. Thank you very much. We monitor Western media and have an impression that the process of coalition building is very slow, lots of problems. Nobody knows when it will be over. It doesn't add to optimism in the eyes of international community. So the question is, what is the biggest problem in signing the coalition agreement? I disagree with you. I don't agree that there is any negotiation process has some points, and different groups are working here, and the coalition agreement and the second part is about reforms and concrete steps and concrete deadlines. So they have to discuss it because different political forces they had a different vision on reforms and when to introduce reforms. So this is the process. 5 political forces they sit down at one table and they have to discuss 13 issues. So 7 groups, and it requires a lot of time. They have to go through a lot of materials, and so there are discussions, there are disagreements. The process goes on. Maybe it is not covered in media, but it's very difficult to cover a political discussion how to sign such an agreement. So I would say the process goes on. The issue of I cannot comment political discussions. The end of this week, we'll have more information about the coalition agreement. So political parties have different opinions. It's a fact, and on economy and social sector. There is no question as to movement to Europe, but there are some nuances on healthcare reform, economic deregulation, a lot of issues to energy sector. Here's a question. During the process of reforms, is there any model that you will use from abroad, or do you develop some kind of a unique model which is comes out from Ukrainian reality? When I speak about reforms, we look at some countries as an example. Good examples are Poland, because Poland is approximately of the same size country, and the war in the same state, except the war when they had also a revolution, and then they entered the European Union, and international diplomats and politicians say that Ukraine passed practically several many years comparing to other countries, and also we all experience of Baltic republics, and also example of Georgia, or some issue like a corruption fight and anti-corruption bureau. But we have to understand that in order to implement reforms, we need to have a parliament, and we need to have a government they will take decisions as to reforms. There are lots of examples in the world, and Singapore is also interesting, but they have a different model of governance, so we cannot just copy and paste their ideas. Practically every country of the world has a model. If we speak about how to reform the public service, so we can use Poland, and they took that model from France, etc. So as to how to manage reforms, we use again experience of Baltic countries, so Lithuania, Poland, when they were building, when they created a group that was responsible for reforms, an agency, and then they turned it into the Ministry of European Integration. But that's a question to politicians whether they wanted to set up such a ministry. I have 2 questions to you. The first one. You told that there is the pressure on business is growing. Is there some kind of regional differences, or is it a trend all over the country? The second question, you say that investments, foreign investments, should be protected. It's independently on an owner, Russian business, or which suffers because of raiders attacks, or Western investments. I spoke about foreign investments from the West, because in the majority of cases and meetings I have, I spoke to investors from Western countries, from Canada and from the US. Today I received a letter from a Spanish ambassador from Spanish business. So we speak about investments, about for 10 million, from 10 to 100 million dollars. So the pressure is growing. We speak about a big investors business that came and invest in Ukraine under all the conditions, under these conditions. And it seems to me that state public servants must be careful, and they should defend it so the state protect it, but they should understand that under these conditions we have in the country, to set pressure, to create pressure on international investors, and I saw how that happens. They use courts, etc., and illegal issues. We should do everything possible. I call state public servants who have conscience and who have pride for their country. They must stop the pressure on investors. So Russian businessmen don't come up to you. What about regional specifics? I don't have that information. And all the cases we have that's from Western Western business. The war. Polish experts here, they spoke about decentralization, but they believe that a key issue for success in Poland is because there was, for every reform, there was a responsible person, a concrete person who was not. When you discuss, when there is a discussion about a coalition agreement, is there such an idea? Will it happen? Because we had some quite a different practice in Ukraine, and that's why we don't have success.
In the discussions on coalition agreements, there are some focuses, and what is in this agreement particularly concerns responsibility of ministers, that is, financial responsibilities and liability of the minister for certain reform direction. And this responsibility and liability may not be transferred to any other body. Speaking about the National Council, the Executive Council for Reforms, we try to involve methodological, moderational, and coordination support. We foster communication support as well. But the very development of reforms and their implementation should be within the scope of responsibility of individual ministries, whether it will be the one in European integration I already mentioned, or some other ministry. We are still discussing that. But speaking of practices regarding that, yes, it can be seen in European countries, in those who have recently joined the EU. Normally they have a kind of agency, governmental agency, that grows into a sort of a ministry dealing with European integration and providing horizontal policies on EU. I have a question for you. The Investor Council was established already at the times of Yushchenko, and then Tymoshenko created a council of her own. Then came the time for Yanukovych, the same. What's the difference between them and your Foreign Investor Advisory Council, and what are the selection criteria? Thank you for the question. Actually, I had a chance, given that I did represent a company that had a council like that in its organization. I had a chance to see how they have meetings. Normally, it is just a formal meeting. Times these meetings can be not really efficient because seldom they take into account suggestions offered by expert groups, and you may hear same things from other foreign investors who participated in such work groups. We are about to create a council which will unite acting and active investors, and possibly they will represent more of investors, greater number of them. It should include representatives of investor associations as well. And our vision is that the conceptual development of this council should aim actually at ascertaining investment possibilities of the country, discussing these possibilities, because investors and investment funds better understand the developmental needs. I had a meeting with investors right before this, my appearance here. We discussed the rule of law issues, pressure on businesses, transparency matters, etc., which boils down to overall attractiveness of Ukraine. Then we have investment projects. There are governmental projects, and we need certain expert community to discuss these projects. And the third thing is we need to learn more of problems and issues stalking investors operating in Ukraine. We need to be able to not just study these barriers, but also be able to resolve these issues. We need to understand that a foreign investor, it is actually money pouring into the national economy. It is new job places. It is new economic processes launched inside the country, and this is really of importance. The current rating of Ukraine is 3C, which means it is very hard to attract money in the country. And whenever we have an investor coming here and showing his readiness to invest in the country, we need to do everything to help him stay. And if there are cases when sabotage happens, when unscrupulous people appear, we need to cut short these attempts, and we need to make it publicly, to make this process really a public one, because the protection of investment and investors should be a priority of each country pursuing its developmental path. Check for Singapore, how they did protect and have been protecting their investors. There should be some levers, some controlling levers to see how the investment process unfolds. And there should be measures taken by the state to really attract investors. Check for Georgia. How did they attract investors to fully redevelop the Batumi area? Every economy develops with investment money. And it were investments who helped the U.S. to overcome the crisis. Thank you. If no more questions, we'll wait for you next Tuesday. We are going to have a special briefing by Dmytro Shymkiv, OSCE mission head. He will have this briefing at 3.